Welcome to the Ask Junior Monthly Judgment Podcast. I'm Priya Sharma, and joining me today is Rahul Kapoor. Before we dive in, we'd like to remind our listeners to like, subscribe, and share this podcast if you find it informative. Your support helps us reach more people interested in understanding key legal judgments.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to be here. Today, we'll be discussing some of the most important Calcutta High Court judgments from September 2024. We've handpicked these cases for their significance and the insights they provide into various areas of law.
Thanks, Rahul. It's great to be here discussing these important cases. We have quite a few interesting judgments to cover today, ranging from family law to criminal matters, and even some intriguing administrative law cases. Shall we start with one of the family law cases?
Absolutely, Priya. Let's begin with the case of Dr. Gaurav Gupta versus State of West Bengal and Oris, which was heard by the Calcutta High Court on September 2, 2024. This case deals with a habeas corpus petition filed by a father seeking custody of his children.
That's right, Rahul. For our listeners who might not be familiar with the term, a habeas corpus petition is a legal action that can be used to challenge the legality of someone's detention, or in this case, to seek custody of children. It's a fundamental right enshrined in our Constitution.
Exactly. In this case, the High Court held that the habeas corpus writ petition was not maintainable. The court's reasoning was based on the fact that multiple proceedings were already pending between the parties before civil courts under various acts, including the Hindu Marriage Act and the Guardians and Wards Act.
That's an important point, Rahul. The court essentially said that since there were already ongoing legal proceedings to determine custody and related matters, there was no need for the extraordinary jurisdiction of the High Court to be invoked through a habeas corpus petition.
Precisely. The court noted that no special circumstances were established that would prompt them to exercise this extraordinary jurisdiction. It's worth mentioning that habeas corpus is considered an extraordinary remedy, typically used in cases of illegal detention or when there's an urgent need to determine the whereabouts of a person.
This case highlights the importance of using the appropriate legal channels for different types of disputes. The High Court seems to be saying, look, you already have the right forums to address your custody issues. You don't need to escalate this to a habeas corpus petition.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that our legal system has specific procedures and forums for different types of cases, and it's crucial to follow these established pathways. The court here is essentially directing the parties back to the civil courts to resolve their custody and visitation rights issues.
It's also interesting to note that the court didn't make any findings on the merits of the case or the principles around the welfare of the children. They're leaving that entirely to the pending civil court proceedings.
That's a crucial point, Priya. The High Court is respecting the jurisdiction and expertise of the civil courts in handling these family matters. It's a good example of how different courts within our legal system work together and respect each other's domains.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to another interesting case from September 2, 2024. This one involves the Indian Institute of Management Calcutta and some retired library staff. The case is Indian Institute of Management Calcutta and Oris versus Anantakumar D. and Oris.
This case is particularly interesting because it deals with the concept of fence sitters in legal claims and the principles of delay, waiver, acquiescence, and laches. Could you explain the background of this case, Priya?
Certainly, Rahul. The case revolves around some retired library staff of IIM Calcutta who were seeking revised pay scale benefits. These benefits had been granted to other similarly situated library staff earlier through court orders. However, the High Court held that these particular respondents were not entitled to the benefits.
And why was that? It seems unfair at first glance that some staff members got the benefits while others didn't.
The court's reasoning was based on several legal principles. First, they found that the respondent's claim was time-barred due to delay, waiver, acquiescence, and laches. In simpler terms, the court said that these staff members waited too long to make their claim.
That's an important principle in law, isn't it? The idea that you can't sit on your rights and then suddenly decide to enforce them years later.
Exactly, Rahul. The court noted that these staff members didn't approach the court during their service period to seek the pay scale revision. This is where the concept of fence sitters comes in. The court essentially said that you can't wait to see how other people's cases turn out and then try to claim the same benefits if they're successful.
That's fascinating. So the court is discouraging a wait-and-see approach to legal claims.
Precisely. The court made it clear that the previous orders granting the pay scale benefits were not in rem, meaning they didn't automatically apply to all similarly situated persons. Each person needed to make their claim in a timely manner.
This case really highlights the importance of being proactive in asserting your legal rights, doesn't it? It's a reminder that you can't always rely on other people's successes to secure your own benefits.
Absolutely, Rahul. It's a lesson in the importance of timely action in legal matters. Now, shall we move on to a case that deals with some interesting aspects of criminal law?
Definitely, Priya. Let's discuss the case of Kusi Ghosh versus the state of West Bengal, which was heard by the Calcutta High Court on September 3, 2024.
This case touches on a very sensitive and complex issue in criminal law, the question of consent in sexual relationships, particularly when there's an allegation of a false promise of marriage. Could you outline the main points of this case, Rahul?
Certainly, Priya. The main issue in this case was whether the victim's consent to the sexual relationship was voluntary or obtained under a misconception of fact due to the petitioner's false promise of marriage. The petitioner, Kusi Ghosh, had filed an application to quash the criminal proceedings against him.
And what did the court decide?
The High Court dismissed the petitioner's application. They found that the allegations in the FIR and the materials in the case diary prima facie indicated that the victim's consent may have been obtained under a misconception of fact due to the petitioner's false promise of marriage.
This is a really complex area of law, isn't it? On one hand, we have the principle that adults should be free to enter into consensual relationships. On the other hand, we need to protect individuals from being deceived or manipulated into sexual relationships.
Exactly, Priya. The court here relied on several Supreme Court judgments which have established that consent obtained by a false promise of marriage is not considered free consent under the law. If the accused never intended to marry the victim and the promise was a mere hoax, then the victim's consent would be considered given under a misconception of fact.
That's a crucial distinction. It's not just about whether a promise of marriage was made, but whether there was ever any intention to fulfill that promise.
Precisely. The court emphasized that this is something that needs to be determined through evidence and by examining the surrounding circumstances. That's why they held that the case couldn't be quashed at this early stage. It needs to go to trial to determine the truth of the matter.
This case really highlights the complexities involved in adjudicating matters of consent, doesn't it? It's not always a straightforward yes or no question.
Absolutely, Priya. It requires a nuanced understanding of the circumstances, the intentions of the parties involved, and the power dynamics at play. It's a reminder of how challenging these cases can be for our legal system.
Indeed, Rahul. Now let's move on to a case that deals with an interesting aspect of administrative law. On September 3, 2024, the Calcutta High Court heard the case of Binata Das versus the state of West Bengal and Ors. This case revolves around a widow's claim for family pension.
This case is particularly interesting because it touches on several important principles of administrative law and social welfare. Could you give us an overview of the case, Priya?
Certainly, Rahul. The petitioner in this case was a widow whose claim for family pension had been rejected by the authorities. The High Court set aside this rejection and directed the authorities to grant her the benefit under a 2010 memorandum, which extended pension benefits to certain employees who retired or died in harness prior to 1981.
That's quite a significant decision. What were the main issues the court had to consider?
There were several key issues. First, there was a question about whether the petitioner had suppressed material facts by not disclosing her husband's alleged resignation letter. The court found that this did not amount to suppression, as the authorities themselves had relied on the petitioner's submissions to bring the fact of resignation to the court's attention.
That's an important point about transparency in legal proceedings. What else did the court consider?
Another crucial aspect was that the authorities failed to produce any documentary evidence to show that the resignation was accepted. The court also noted that the service rules did not provide for forfeiture of past service upon resignation.
So the court was essentially saying that even if there was a resignation, it wouldn't necessarily disqualify the widow from receiving the pension.
Exactly, Rahul. But perhaps the most interesting part of the judgment was how the court interpreted the concept of died in harness.
Can you elaborate on that, Priya? It sounds like a crucial point.
Certainly. The court observed that the husband's sudden discontinuation from service due to ill health should be considered as died in harness for the purpose of granting family pension. They said he was literally alive but dead for all practical purposes in the service records.
That's a very broad and compassionate interpretation of the term died in harness, isn't it?
Indeed it is, Rahul. The court emphasized that denying the petitioner the Social Security benefit under the 2010 memorandum would be contrary to the purpose of the scheme. This judgment really highlights how courts can interpret rules and regulations in a way that aligns with the broader social welfare objectives of legislation.
It's a great example of how the judiciary can step in to ensure that the spirit of the law is upheld, even when the letter of the law might seem to preclude it.
Absolutely, Rahul. It's a reminder of the important role that courts play in interpreting and applying the law in a way that serves the interests of justice and social welfare.
This case also seems to touch on the principle of beneficial legislation, doesn't it? The idea that laws designed to provide benefits should be interpreted liberally in favor of the beneficiaries.
That's an excellent point, Rahul. The court's decision here is very much in line with that principle. They're essentially saying that when there's a scheme designed to provide Social Security benefits, we should interpret it in a way that fulfills its purpose rather than looking for technicalities to deny benefits.
It's heartening to see the court taking such a compassionate approach. Now, shall we move on to another case? I believe we have an interesting one related to criminal investigation.
Yes, we do, Rahul. Let's discuss the case of Steel Authority of India Limited versus the state of West Bengal and ORS, which was heard by the Calcutta High Court on September 3, 2024.
This case involves allegations of forgery and criminal conspiracy regarding the extension of a lease of property belonging to the Steel Authority of India Limited. Doesn't it? What did the court decide?
The High Court made a significant decision in this case. They held that the investigation into the alleged forgery and criminal conspiracy should be transferred to the Detective Department of the Asansol Durgapur Commissionerate.
That's quite a strong move. What led the court to make this decision?
The court found that the police authorities had demonstrated gross inefficiency and negligence in the conduct of their investigation. They failed to take necessary actions, such as forwarding the disputed lease deed for forensic examination, seizing crucial documents, and interrogating key witnesses.
Those sound like pretty basic steps in an investigation of this nature. It's surprising that they weren't carried out.
Exactly, Rahul. The court emphasized the need for a fair and impartial investigation, given the gravity of the matter. We're talking about the potential defrauding of public funds and assets from a government company.
This case really highlights the court's role in ensuring proper investigation of crimes, doesn't it? They're not just passive observers of the criminal justice system.
Absolutely. It's a great example of judicial oversight of the investigative process. The court is essentially saying, if the regular police aren't doing their job properly, we'll step in and make sure a more specialized unit takes over.
This decision could have significant implications for how similar cases are handled in the future, couldn't it? It sends a strong message about the standards expected in criminal investigations, especially when they involve public assets.
That's right, Rahul. It's a reminder that courts can and will intervene if they feel that investigations aren't being conducted thoroughly and impartially. It's an important safeguard in our criminal justice system.
Indeed, Priya. Now, I believe we have time for one more case. Shall we discuss the judgment in Hidayatullah Khan versus the state of West Bengal?
Absolutely, Rahul. This is an interesting case that deals with the Arms Act, The Calcutta High Court heard this case on September 3, 2024.
Could you give us an overview of what this case was about, Priya?
Certainly. This case revolved around whether the petitioner, Hidayatullah Khan, could be charged under Section 251(b)(a) of the Arms Act for failing to renew his valid arms license on time.
And what did the court decide?
The High Court held that the petitioner could not be charged under this section merely for failing to renew his valid arms license on time. They found that since the petitioner had a valid license earlier, the non-renewal did not amount to a contravention of Section 3 of the Act.
That's an interesting distinction. So the court is saying there's a difference between never having a license and failing to renew an existing license.
Exactly, Rahul. The court noted that the issuing authority was responsible for monitoring renewals under the arms rules. They felt that continuing the proceedings against the petitioner would be an abuse of the process of law.
This case seems to highlight the importance of distinguishing between different types of offenses under the Arms Act. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
That's right. The court is essentially saying that we need to be careful about how we apply these laws. Failing to renew a license is a different matter from possessing arms without ever having had a license.
This judgment could have significant implications for how similar cases are handled in the future, couldn't it?
Absolutely, Rahul. It sets a precedent that could affect how authorities and courts interpret and apply this section of the Arms Act. It's a reminder that the law needs to be applied with nuance and consideration of the specific circumstances of each case.
It also seems to put some responsibility on the issuing authorities to be proactive in monitoring license renewals rather than relying solely on criminal proceedings to enforce compliance.
That's an excellent point, Rahul. This judgment is not just about interpreting the law, but also about how it should be administered. It's a good example of how court decisions can influence administrative practices.
Well, Priya, it looks like we've covered a lot of ground today. We've discussed cases ranging from family law to criminal matters, administrative law, and even arms regulation. It's been a fascinating look at the diverse range of issues our courts deal with.
Indeed, it has, Rahul. These cases from September 2024 really showcase the complexity and nuance involved in legal decision-making. They're a reminder of the important role our judiciary plays in interpreting and applying the law in ways that serve justice and the public interest.
Absolutely, Priya. And I think our listeners will have gained some valuable insights into how our legal system works. Thank you all for joining us for this edition of the Ask Junior Monthly Judgment Podcast. We hope you found it informative and engaging.
Thank you, Rahul, and thank you to all our listeners. Remember to like, subscribe, and share this podcast if you enjoyed it. Your engagement helps us continue to provide this valuable content. We also encourage you to leave comments or reviews. We love hearing your thoughts and suggestions for future episodes.
That's right. Your feedback helps us improve and bring you the legal insights you're most interested in. Until next time, this is Rahul Kapoor.
And Priya Sharma signing off. Stay informed, stay curious, and we'll see you next month.